Day 8. Jake noticed sunlight as it came in around the window and door frames. He needed to pee badly, so he got up and felt around for a flashlight and turned it on. He dragged his chamber pot out from underneath his cot. He laid the lid from the pot on the floor and brought the pot up to his open fly and took care of his business. Steve began to stir as the sound of Jake's urine hit the bottom of the porcelain-lined bucket. Jake finished his business and put the lid back on the pot and pushed it back underneath his cot. Steve rolled over and asked, "What time is it?" Jake looked at his watch and said, "It's 6:48. Steve sat up and swung his legs over the side of his cot where he sat for a few minutes to get his bearings before he stood. Steve crinkled and pinched his nose shut. "What's that god-awful smell? Did something crawl under the cabin and die?" Jake said, "Dude, you'd be amazed at the orchestral symphony your body makes while you sleep. You should call your masterpiece, Flatulence in G major." "Don't be a wise ass," Steve said and asked, "Why the key of G?" "Because of your major G as attack." Steve laughed, and so did Jake. Jake made his way over to the door and opened it cautiously. When he saw the coast was clear, he opened it fully to air out the cabin. He turned off the flashlight and walked over to the stove to start a fire so he could make a pot of coffee. He thought he should wait a few minutes before he lit the fire because Steve's masterpiece still hung heavily on the air inside the cabin. The last few notes and chords of his symphony haven't quite faded into silence. Jake busied himself and got the coffee pot ready in the meantime. He used 3 bottles of water to fill the coffee pot and filled the basket with fresh grounds and set the pot on the stove. He found his cigarettes and lighter on the table, and before he thought about it, he lit up a smoke. He thought, "I no longer need to worry about the cabin blowing up because it's had a sufficient amount of time to air out." He went back over to the stove and started the fire. The stove inside the cabin was a smaller version of Jake's grandma's old stoves, so it heated a lot faster. Within 10 minutes, the coffee perked. Jake poured them a cup and took his cup outside to drink it while he finished his cigarette. When he took his first sip of coffee, he thought, "I wish I had some creamer to put in it. I don't like it black. For the time being, I'll just have to suffer through it." Jake scanned the bottom for any sign of the creatures, but didn't see anything. He did notice a small hairline crack in the middle of the cabin door. The crack ran vertically from top to bottom. He pointed the crack out to Steve and said, "The creatures were almost successful in their attempt to get inside last night." Steve moved to the open doorway and sat. "We'll need to get a board and nail it over the crack to reinforce the door when we make another trip to the house later. I hope we can find the hammer and enough nails in the mess inside the house to do it," Jake said. "Don't forget I threw the axe down at the bottom of the hillside last night while I looked for the key." Steve said, "If the axe is there, we need to find it and bring it back here." Jake said, "We'll need to pick to the cellar to find some food. We can use the buckets in the cellar to haul the mason jars back here. After we empty the buckets, we can fill them with water from the spring. We'll probably need to make a separate trip to the house to get a board, the hammer, and some nails to fix the door unless you think we can get those items when we get the food. Afterward, we're gonna have to make a few trips to the woodpile to stock up on some more firewood. It might be a good idea to get the 2 kitchen chairs from the house so we won't have to sit on the floor or on the cots all the time. It'll also be nice to sit at the table to eat." "You're right," Steve said. "That sounds like a plan." Jake said, "I don't see any sign of the creatures. I'm gonna go find the axe." "You'd better be careful." "I'll be back," Jake said as he took their now well-worn path from the cabin down the remainder of the hillside and stopped just inside the tree line. Jake scanned the area for any sign of the creatures before he walked out into the open bottom. He retraced his steps back toward the retreat and found the axe in the weeds about 125 yards from the tree line. He picked the axe up and walked back to the cabin. When he made his way back up the hillside, he heard a tree knock come from the other side of the river near the bridge. A few seconds later, he heard another tree knock come from farther up the hillside above the cabin. He assumed the Bigfoot on the other side of the river saw him while he looked for the axe and alerted its kin to his whereabouts. He also assumed the creatures probably observed them at all times. Jake often felt like he was being watched anytime he stepped outside. It's a feeling so intense at times, it raised the hair on the back of his neck. He made it back to the cabin door and asked, "Did you hear the tree knocks?" while trying to catch his breath. "Yeah, I heard them." Jake reached inside the cabin door and leaned the axe against the wall next to the table. Steve said, "I'm surprised you found the axe. I assumed the creature which chased us might have found it last night." Jake stood outside the doorway and looked at Steve. Why would a Bigfoot need an axe? Steve smiled and said, "So it can chop its way through the door, of course." "I wouldn't put it past one of those damned monsters to learn how to use one," Jake said and chuckled. Steve said, "After I finish my second cup of coffee, I'll be ready to go to the house to get the stuff on our list." Jake asked, "Do you hear that?" "Yeah, I sure do," Steve said as he jumped to his feet. Jake said, "Someone's coming down the mountain. It sounds like they're above the barnyard. I'm gonna run down the trail, the flag aimed down." "Go," Steve said. "I'll join you as soon as I get my shoes on." Jake ran down the main trail, which met the road just as a large black pickup rounded the curve on the hillside. He ran out into the road and threw his hands over his head and waved them back and forth to get the driver's attention so he would slow down and hopefully stop. Jake realized this was the same vehicle they saw a few days ago, which carried the two hillbillies who almost ran them over. He stood in the middle of the road, determined to get the driver's attention and not let him get past. The driver hit the brakes and skidded to a stop a few feet in front of him. The driver shouted through his open window, "What the hell? Man, I almost ran you over. Why are you standing in the middle of the road?" Both the driver and the passenger looked annoyed. The passenger opened his door and got out and walked toward the front of the truck while he carried a baseball bat. The driver shifted the truck into park. Jake threw his hands up into the air and shouted, "We need help." Steve approached and saw Jake as he stood with his hands in the air. He stopped and put his hands up as well to indicate he was unarmed. Jake suspected Steve thought the passenger pulled a gun on him because he couldn't see the baseball bat. The passenger held the bat below the hood of the truck. The driver opened his door and got out. He approached Jake from his side of the vehicle while he carried a knife. "Well, man," Jake said as back stepped, "I don't want any trouble. Me and my buddy over there have been trapped here for the past 8 days. The driver said, "Trapped?" "Yeah," Jake said. "We can't make it to our car, which is parked on the other side of the river near the bridge." The passenger lowered the baseball bat. "Why?" The driver turned towards Steve and lowered his knife and nodded at Steve to indicate it was okay for him to approach. Steve put his arms down and walked beside Jake and told the driver, "Several hairy wild men chase us every time we try to get to our car." The passenger said, "The creatures are hassling you, huh?" Jake's jaw dropped. His eyes widened. "You know about them?" "Yeah," they said simultaneously. Jake said, "Both me and Steve aren't too sure what they are. We suspect they're the supposed Bigfoot we've heard about in the headlines of the newspapers, saw stories about on the evening news, or seen in the movies." "You're right. They're Bigfoots. They hassle us from time to time," the driver said. "They usually leave us alone for a while when we shoot at them." Jake asked, "So, you have guns then?" "Yeah, but not with us," the passenger said as he looked back up the road. "They're back up in our cabin at the top of the mountain." The driver asked, "Who are you guys anyway?" "I'm Jake Jackson. My grandparents used to own this property before they died. Me and my buddy here, Steve Porter, decided we'd take a 2-week vacation here to fish and get some deserved rest and relaxation. This trip's been nothing of the sort. We've been in fear for our lives since not too long after we got here." The passenger asked, "You're the grandson of Sally and Mason Jackson?" "Yeah," Jake said. The passenger said, I never got to meet your grandparents before they passed away, but their reputation is strong around these parts. Your grandparents were extremely kind people." "I know they were," Jake said. The passenger offered his hand and said, "My name's Eugene Fisher, and my buddy here is Bo Shamblin," as he glanced in Bo's direction. While Jake shook Bo's hand, Eugene said, "People call me Gene for short." Steve was shaking hands with both of them when Jake glanced toward Gene and asked, "Your cabin on top of the mountain?" "Yeah, Bo and me bought the cabin about 2.5 years ago. We turned it into a hunting retreat when the family who lived there sold it to us and moved out. Steve and me have waited until either you guys came back by or our old neighbors, the McAdams, came down to check on the property." "We're your only neighbors," Bo said while he glanced toward top of the mountain. "Everyone else who lived up there moved away, and we're the only people within several miles up there, and that's only if we're here hunting. We only use our cabin part-time," Gene said as he leaned against the truck. "I suppose the McAdams and everyone else who lived close by up there got tired of the Bigfoot hassling them, so they moved into the city to get away from them." Jake looked at Gene and said, "I wasn't even aware they'd moved, period." "Both me and Gene live in Buckhannon, West Virginia, and came to our cabin about 3 weeks ago, but we only planned to stay a week. We forded the river, but we can't get back across it to go home." "Yeah, I know where Buckhannon is. I've been there plenty of times," Jake said. Gene said, "That's why you guys saw us the other day. We came down to see if the water started to recede, and that's why we're here now." "It looks like the river has receded a little bit," Jake said. "It's still too deep to cross it, even in your truck. You guys don't know how to get out the other way." "Yeah, but we don't have enough gas to go that way, and I don't think I have enough to get to the gas station near the hard road," Bo said. Jake and Steve explained to Bo and Gene how the Bigfoot harassed them. They explained how the one Bigfoot broke into the house and how it destroyed it along with the retreat down the road. Gene said, "I didn't think the creatures were that ballsy." Jake explained he and Steve were holed up in the cabin on the hillside and how the creatures tried to get into it last night. Steve explained how they had no weapons except for the pitchfork, axe, and hatchet. Bo chuckled and asked, "You guys didn't bring a gun?" "We didn't think we'd need one," Jake said. "We picked through the remains of the retreat and found an old 12-gauge shotgun, but we couldn't find any ammo." Steve rubbed his hands together while he looked directly at Bo. "Can you guys help us get to the bridge and to our car on the other side of the river? We've tried to escape, but there's a large male Bigfoot on the other side of the river which prevents us from getting to our car and getting the hell out of here," Jake explained. "What's he doing guarding your car?" Gene asked as he looked toward the bridge. "Yeah, it seems that way," Jake said as a tree knock resonated from the hillside above where they stood in the road. "It sounds like the natives are getting restless," Gene simply stated while he looked in the direction of the tree knock and asked, "Do you know how many creatures we're dealing with?" Jake said, "From what we can figure out, there are at least 4, but we suspect there are more. Give us about 45 minutes while we go back to our cabin and get our rifles so we can help you guys get safely across the river and get out of here," Bo said as he climbed back into the truck. Gene said, "While we go get our guns, you guys should go ahead and get your stuff together." "Now that sounds like a plan," Steve said, his eyes gleaming. Gene got back in the truck and Bo turned it around and drove back up the mountain. Jake and Steve walked the trail back to the cabin. Another tree knot permeated the air. It came from just up the trail beyond the cabin in the direction of the spring. Jake and Steve quickened their pace. When they arrived at the cabin, Jake said, "The only things we need to take with us are our duffel bags. We can leave the other shit here." "Yeah," Steve said. "We can leave the rest of the stuff and lock the cabin back up." They threw their stuff into their duffel bags and set them on the ground outside, next to the cabin door. Jake stepped back outside and lit a cigarette. Steve sat down in the doorway and they talked while they waited and listened for Bo and Gene's return. They heard another tree not come from the same direction as the last one. This one sounded closer. "Do you think we should wait inside?" Steve asked as he glanced at Jake, his forehead furrowed. Jake said, "No," as he stepped past the corner of the cabin where he could look up the trail in the direction of the spring. "If I see a creature approach, we can grab our bags and head back inside the cabin." "Okay," Steve said while he looked at Jake and shook his head. "Maybe you should put your cigarette out because the smoke might draw the Bigfoot closer." Jake dropped his cigarette and extinguished it under his foot. He continued to look up the trail but didn't see anything. They continued to wait for another 15 minutes and expected Bo and Gene to arrive at any time. "I think I can hear them coming. Grab your duffel bag. We'll meet them on the road," Jake said as he grabbed his duffel bag and turned and closed and locked the cabin door. He met Steve on the trail. While they walked down the trail to the road, Steve said, "Maybe now we can get out of this hellhole," a gleam in his eye and a smile on his face. "Hell yeah," Jake said and smiled. When they reached the road, Bo and Gene were still out of their line of sight because the road curved before it reached the bottom of the mountain. Jake said, "Based on the sounds of the rocks crunching, it sounds like they're on the road above the barnyard." They heard either Gene or Bo yell, "Oh shit." Now it sounded like they both yelled. Through both their yells, Jake and Steve heard a Bigfoot scream and a loud metallic scraping sound. They next heard what sounded like the pickup barrel roll over the hillside and crash into the woods below. Jake and Steve looked at each other and paled. Jake asked himself, could it be? Then he asked aloud, could Gene and Bo have wrecked their truck and rolled over the hillside down into the woods below? Steve looked at Jake. God, I hope not. Their suspicions were confirmed a couple seconds later when they heard a loud explosion and saw a fireball rise way above the tree line in the direction of the barnyard. A Bigfoot screamed again from the same general direction. They both dropped their duffel bags and ran toward the house so they could cut through the yard to get to the barnyard. This route was faster than trying to climb the road. When they reached the barnyard gate, they heard a pop, pop, pop sound. They could clearly see the truck as it lay upside down several hundred yards behind the right side of the barn, and it was completely on fire. They quickly ran toward the blazing vehicle. The pop sound subsided when they got to within 50 feet from the truck. The roof of the truck was almost completely caved in. It became apparent either Gene or Bo had been killed because one of them lay half in and half out of the driver's side of the truck. The body had been completely consumed in the explosion and resulting fire. They assumed it was Bo since he was the one who drove earlier. They heard a few more pop sounds come from the truck and figured out they were bullets going off from the intense heat of the fire. Another scream emanated from the road above them. Steve pointed in the direction of the scream, and they saw a massive black-colored Bigfoot as it stood in the road and looked down at the carnage which lay before them. The Bigfoot turned and headed into the trees and climbed the mountain out of their view. Steve said, "I'm glad it didn't come this way." Jake said, "Don't forget about the two in the pig pen and barn." They looked in both directions and didn't see anything. The fire which came from the truck had subsided enough they could approach the passenger side of the vehicle to see if Gene's body was inside it. They had no idea what condition his body would be in because the passenger side of the truck cab was flattened significantly more than the driver's side. Jake got down on his hands and knees near the passenger door to try and see inside. The inside of the truck was completely charred. The back of the passenger seat was pressed flat and melted into the ceiling of the truck. The seat bottom lacked maybe 5 inches from touching the inside of the ceiling of the truck. Jake looked behind the seats in the ceiling to see if he could spot Gene's body, but it wasn't there. He did notice a mangled rifle which lay on the ceiling in the small space behind both seats. The rifle's wooden stock had burned completely away, and the barrel was bent and twisted. Jake said, "There's no sign of Gene." Maybe Gene was thrown clear of the wreckage or stayed behind at their cabin, Steve said as he looked beyond the carnage. Jake said, "Maybe we should scout the area behind the truck and into the woods to see if we can find him," as he looked in that direction. They made their way past the wreckage and looked in all directions through the trees to try to find Gene. They covered nearly 1,000 square yards before they gave up their search. There was no sign of him anywhere. Maybe he's underneath the bed of the truck, Jake said. We haven't looked there yet. Because the cab of the truck was flattened and the truck lay upside down, the sides of the truck bed almost lay flat on the ground. Jake looked around for a large tree limb he could use for leverage to lift the truck bed off of the ground while Steve looked underneath it for Gene. Jake couldn't find one, so he said, "Let's get a 4x4 post from the pile behind the barn." Steve retrieved the post and placed it behind the driver's side of the cab underneath the edge of the truck bed. Jake said, "While I use the board for leverage to lift the truck up, you get on your hands and knees and look underneath the bed." Once Steve was in position, Jake lifted the truck. He could barely lift it, let alone hold it off of the ground for very long. He briefly held it a few inches off the ground, which was just enough time for Steve to look underneath it. Steve said, "There's no one there." As Jake dropped the truck and the 4x4 post, they heard another scream come from near the top of the mountain in the direction the large black Bigfoot went earlier. "We need to go back and pick up our duffel bags and head back to the cabin," Jake said. "It looks like we aren't going anywhere." Steve cussed and ran it and said, "Damn it. That's it. I've had it. I don't care if one of these fucking things attacks me on my way to the car, but I'm gonna get the fuck out of here one way or another. Those damned motherfuck—" "Calm down," Jake yelled, his face flushed, eyes narrowed and veins popping in his neck. "Let's go back to the cabin and regroup. At least we'll be someplace safe while we plan another way out of here." "Do you hear the creatures? The one on the ridge screaming and the other one up the trail behind the cabin doing the wood knocks? They're out in full force today. If you try to leave now, you'll get attacked and you'll surely die." Steve said, "I don't care," as he looked at Jake and kicked dirt toward the wreckage and clutched his fists. Jake gave Steve a little time to think things over, and Steve calmed down and stopped his rant. To change the subject, Jake said, "The Bigfoot we saw on the road after we got here was probably responsible for their deaths." "Why do you say that?" Steve asked curtly. "Stop and think about it," Jake said. "The first sound we heard as Bo or Gene approached was a loud scraping sound. We next heard a scream from the Bigfoot and then the awful sound of the truck as it rolled down the hill. I'd venture to say the Bigfoot ran out in front of Bo or Gene or whoever was in the truck, likely Bo, and he slammed on the brakes and swerved to keep from hitting the Bigfoot. Bo or Gene lost control of the truck, and it slipped off the side of the road and rolled over several times before it crashed to its final resting spot." "Your theory kind of makes sense," Steve said as he let out a deep breath. "Even if we can make it to my car, do you think it would be any match against a Bigfoot?" Jake asked and said, "If a Bigfoot can force a 3-ton truck off of the road, imagine what it can do to a mid-sized car? We have to slowly travel 4 miles up that old dirt road before we make it to the hard road. We have to go up and down hills and around blind curves where a Bigfoot might be waiting to run us out of the road. Do you want to meet your demise like Bo or Gene?" "You've got a good point." They headed back through the barnyard toward the house so they could cut through the yard to get back to where they left their duffel bags. On the way, Jake said, "Since we're going by the cellar, maybe we should stop and gather up some canned food to take back to the cabin. It'll at least make for one less trip." Steve nodded. While they passed by the house, Jake said, "Wait for me because I want to go inside to get the kitchen chairs." He brought both chairs back outside and sat them down near the front gate and said, "We can each carry a chair along with a bucket of mason jars back to the bottom of the main trail. We can leave the chairs sit while we carry our duffel bags and the food back to the cabin and then return for them. We can then take a quick break before we go back to the woodpile to get more firewood." Steve said, "That sounds like a plan." Steve followed Jake to the cellar door. Jake retrieved his keys from his pocket and searched for the key, which unlocked the padlock on the door. He soon had the door unlocked and pushed it open. Steve whistled and said, "I never would have imagined this little building, which is the size of a single car garage, could be so organized and contain enough food to resemble a grocery store." Jake laughed and stepped aside as Steve made his way inside the cellar. Mason jars were stacked neatly on shelves from front to back and from floor to ceiling throughout the cellar, with only maybe an 18-inch space between each of the rows. 3 5-gallon galvanized buckets sat to the right just inside the cellar door. Jake said, "Hand me a bucket and don't forget to check the dates on the lids of anything you'd like to take back to the cabin to eat. Be on the lookout for some of Grandma's homemade canned sausage and sausage gravy. You'll love it because it's the best on the planet." While Steve picked up and looked through the mason jars, he said, "I'll try to keep an eye out for it." They had to walk the jars toward the open door of the cellar to read the handwritten dates on their lids. Most were dated 8 years prior. Jake said, because Grandma rotated her stock every year, the newest jars should be located at the back of all the rows. Also look for any discoloration in the food and for any sign of mold. If you find any, set the jar to the side. Jake picked up jars of yellow squash, green beans, carrots, corn, and what appeared to be canned pork. The canned pork he wasn't too sure about because his grandma would also can beef, bear meat, and other types of meats he had a difficult time trying to identify when he looked at it through the glass mason jar. His bucket was full, so he set it down outside the cellar door and picked up the other bucket and continued to shop. Steve said, "I found what looks like jars of sausage patties and jars of sausage gravy. Is the gravy supposed to be cream colored?" "Yeah, the gravy's an off-white color," Jake said while he picked up several jars of canned potatoes and a few jars of canned peaches and pears. When Steve walked back to the cellar door, he stopped. "My bucket's full and we shouldn't stay in here too much longer because you never know when one of those things might show up," he said as he held his bucket up to show to Jake. Jake's second bucket was also full, so he agreed and turned to follow Steve back outside. Jake said, "Hold on a minute. I see a small cabinet in the corner to the left, behind the door. Go on outside because I want to take a look inside the cabinet and I have to close the door to get to it." Steve walked out the door. Jake closed the cellar door and opened the cabinet door and shouted, "I found some more food. Do you have any more room in your bucket for a few bags of beans and rice?" Steve shouted, "Yeah." Jake opened the door and handed Steve 2 bags of each. He placed the same amount in his bucket and then walked outside to join Steve. He closed and locked the cellar door and picked up his other bucket of food and followed Steve toward the front gate. Jake placed both buckets of food in his left hand and picked up a kitchen chair and walked to the trail to get back to the cabin. Steve followed Jake while he carried his bucket and the other kitchen chair. They arrived at where they left their duffel bags and Jake set his chair down and picked up his bag by the strap and slung it over his right shoulder. Steve did the same and they walked up the trail to the cabin. Steve said, "All is quiet, which is a good thing. I can't imagine getting chased by one of the creatures and losing all the canned food we're carrying." Jake nodded. They made it back to the cabin without incident, and Jake set his buckets down so he could fish his keys out of his pocket to unlock the door. He opened the door and picked his buckets back up and carried them inside and placed them on the table. Steve did the same. They threw their duffel bags on their respective cots. Jake walked over to the table and unloaded the buckets and walked back and forth to put the canned goods on the shelves. When Jake unpacked Steve's bucket, he noticed, in addition to the jars of sausage and sausage gravy, Steve grabbed a jar of beets, a couple jars of tomatoes, 3 jars of corn, a couple jars of homemade dill pickles, a jar of what appeared to be turnips, and several jars of his grandma's homemade vegetable soup. Jake thought, "It definitely looks like we won't starve anytime soon." Jake stacked the empty buckets together and set them under the table. While he busily stacked the jars on the shelves, Steve went back down the trail and got the chairs. He stepped inside as he carried them both. He placed one on each side of the table and sat in the one closest to the door. Jake finished up and sat across from him in the chair between the table and stove. He lit a cigarette and opened a bottle of water. He reached behind himself and grabbed another bottle from off the stove and offered it to Steve. Jake looked at his watch and it indicated it was 1:09 p.m. Jake said, We shouldn't rest for too long because we still need to get more firewood and then go to the spring afterward to fill the empty buckets with water. I agree, Steve said. I want to be back inside the cabin well before nightfall. I can't argue with that. Jake finished his cigarette and both of them finished their bottles of water before they headed back down the trail to the woodpile. They made 4 trips to and from the woodpile and each of them carried large armloads of firewood. They deposited the firewood in a neat pile inside the cabin underneath the window. Steve sat at the table when he finished. As Jake stacked the last of his load of firewood, he said, "Since there's been no sign of the creatures, I'm going to open the shutter to let some more light into the cabin." Jake removed the brace which secured the shutter and opened it. On the other side of the glass stood a huge black-colored Bigfoot. Its eyes glared at him. Jake jumped back away from the window while he shouted, "Shut and secure the door." Without hesitation, Steve jumped from the table and slammed the door shut and placed the 4x4 brace into position to secure it. He turned back toward the window in time to see the Bigfoot tilt its head back and bare its teeth while it looked at both him and Jake with a sinister look in its eye. Before Jake could react and close the shutter, the Bigfoot growled and smashed its right hand and arm through the glass. They raced to the window and tried to close the shutter, but the Bigfoot's arm was in the way. Steve picked up a piece of firewood and beat the Bigfoot's arm out of the way, while Jake forced all his weight against the shutter to get it closed. The Bigfoot blindly tried to grab them several times through the window while they tried to force the shutter closed. It grabbed a hold of the end of the piece of firewood Steve used to beat its arm away with. Steve let go of the piece of firewood and picked up another piece and continued to use it to beat its arm and hand out of the way. The creature dropped the piece of firewood it grabbed from Steve, and it fell back onto the woodpile. Jake was able to get the right end of the 4x4 brace into the bracket on the right side of the window frame. The Bigfoot growled and screamed even louder as Steve hit its hand and arm with the new piece of firewood while Jake smashed its arm against the cabin wall with the shutter. The Bigfoot finally pulled its arm back through the opening and the shutter crashed shut. Jake forced the other end of the 4x4 brace into its bracket on the left side of the window frame. The shutter was now fully secured. The Bigfoot banged on the shutter in an angry rage. Jake shouted, "Turn on a flashlight." Steve felt around and found and lit the flashlight. The Bigfoot repeatedly pounded on the shutter and would only stop briefly to grunt and howl. It was apparent the creature wasn't going to get inside the cabin because the shutter was too sturdily built. In all the commotion, however, neither Jake and Steve or the Bigfoot itself knocked a sizable chunk of chinking out from between the logs underneath and to the right of the window. Daylight flooded in between the logs along with the Bigfoot's left hand. The Bigfoot tried to get a grip on the inside of the log to dislodge it from the wall. Jake picked up his club and smashed its hand and fingers against the log. It let go of the log and let out a horrendous shriek and sounded like it retreated away from the cabin. The shriek faded as it headed back up the hillside and deeper into the woods. Jake and Steve sat at the table and both of them looked as though they would melt into puddles onto the cabin floor. Jake's heart was pumping so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He asked, "Can you hear my heart beating?" Steve said, "I can only hear my own." With Steve's comment, Jake gathered Steve was just as worked up and frightened as he was. "I'm sick and tired of this shit," Jake said. "I'm tired of being chased by the boogeyman. I'm tired of being held captive in what was once a wonderful place to visit. I want revenge." Steve said, "Chill out, man. We both know there's absolutely nothing we can do about our situation now. Our only hope is if we don't make it home on time. Maybe your dad and mom will come looking for us. God, I hope not. We don't need to have them get involved and get killed the minute they step out of their truck across the river. Yeah, you're right. It's going to be up to us to find a way out of here." "I agree," Steve said. "We're just going to have to take our chances and find another way out of here." Jake said, "I don't understand how the Bigfoot could get so close to the damned cabin without us here at approach." We made a lot of noise stacking the firewood, and we probably didn't hear it approach because of that. You're probably right. We forgot to get a board and the hammer and nails to secure the crack in the door. I don't think that door will survive another beating if the creatures come back and beat on it like they did last night. Well, Steve said, we're gonna have to make another trip back to the house. Jake said, I'm not going anywhere for a little while because I need to calm down. Yeah, me too. Jake lit the lantern which sat on the stove behind him and said, turn the flashlight off to save the batteries. Do you want to eat anything before we go back to the house? I'm starting to get a little hungry and wouldn't mind heating up some of the canned pork I found in the cellar, along with some corn and potatoes. That sounds good. I can eat. Jake moved the lantern and bottled water from the stove. He set the lantern on the table and put the bottled water on the shelves. He started a fire in the stove. He retrieved a jar of the pork, corn, and potatoes and opened them one at a time and smelled the contents of each of the jars. Everything smelled okay. He asked, will you smell the contents of these jars? Steve sniffed the top of each jar and said, nothing smells bad or rancid. Jake poured the pork and its juice into the frying pan and mixed the corn and diced potatoes together in the saucepan and placed them side by side on the stove. The smell of the food overtook the inside of the cabin and they both drooled. Jake laughed and said, when we start eating any of the beans, I'm gonna ration your portion because I don't want to hear or smell another fart symphony like I experienced last night. Steve laughed and gave Jake the finger while he stood and pulled a couple paper plates from the dwindling stack on the shelves and placed them on the table along with a couple of forks and steak knives. Lunch was ready and Jake said, step up to the stove and fill your plate. While Steve got his plate ready, Jake retrieved 2 bottles of water and placed one on either side of the table. He realized there were only 4 bottles of water left in addition to the 2 he just picked up and said, we're gonna have to go to the spring and fill up the buckets because we'll run out of water by bedtime. Steve sat and said, add it to the list. Jake filled his plate and sat and asked, well, how is it? Everything tastes great. Yeah, we used to eat things like this all the time when Grandma and Grandpa were still living. Grandma used to cook at home like she did when she worked in the lumberjack camps. It was nothing to sit down to a 9-course meal 3 times a day. Grandma would make homemade biscuits for breakfast and homemade cornbread or white bread for dinner every day. I wish we had some of her homemade cornbread right now. Steve smiled and said, don't tease me. They finished their meal and Jake threw both of their paper plates into the fire chamber in the stove. He set the remainder of the food to the side to cool so he could place it back into the empty jars. He sat at the table and lit a cigarette and said, I'll be ready to go get the board as soon as I finish my smoke. I'll be ready by then. Even though it's been a little while since the Bigfoot which burst through the window has fled, we should take the pitchfork and the axe with us just to be on the safe side. I agree, Jake said. I'm never stepping outside this cabin again without protection. Yeah, we don't need any more hillbillies running around down here. Jake smiled as he gave Steve the finger and asked, are you ready to go? Yeah, Steve said as he stood. Steve carefully opened the front door and looked around for any sign of the Bigfoot. He opened the door fully and stepped outside when he was sure the coast was clear. Jake followed behind him and flicked his cigarette on the ground and snubbed it with his heel. Jake closed the door and checked to make sure he had his keys before he locked it. With weapons in hand, they made their way down the trail to the house. Jake said, we should have brought a flashlight with us because it'll be difficult to find loose nails scattered on the floor inside the dark house. We only need about a dozen or so to nail the board to the door, and it shouldn't be too difficult to pick through the remains of the kitchen to find them, Steve said and asked, is there anything else you can think of we might need from the house? We can use a few more pots and pans and maybe some plates and glasses, Jake said. We only have about a dozen or so paper plates left. Steve said, you can round that stuff up while I look for the hammer and nails. Okay, Jake said. They arrived at the house and stepped inside through the broken and splintered door frame. Jake busied himself as he looked for unbroken plates and glasses. He found several and placed them down in a large stock pot he picked up from off the floor beside the stove, along with a couple smaller saucepans. He looked around the kitchen to see if he could find anything else they might need. He gathered some more silverware from off the floor and placed it inside a glass and placed the glass inside the pot with the others. As Jake looked around the kitchen, there was pretty much nothing left because everything which remained was virtually destroyed. Steve said, "I found the hammer and gathered what I think is enough nails to secure the board to the cabin door." They stepped back onto the front porch where Jake picked up the axe and Steve picked up the pitchfork and board before they headed back to the cabin. They made it back without incident. They didn't see any sign of the Bigfoot. Jake unlocked and opened the door and they put their goods inside. Jake grabbed the buckets from underneath the table and said, "We should go ahead and get the water." They stepped back outside and Jake closed the door behind them, but he didn't lock it this time. He slipped the hook of the padlock through the eyebolt of the hasp and let the lock dangle. He didn't see any need to lock the door because they were only traveling a few hundred yards up the trail behind the cabin. They made it to the spring and noticed the creatures must be using it as a source for water, just like they now had to. There were several various sized footprints in the soft earth underneath the metal pipe which jutted from the hillside. Some prints looked like a young child's footprints while others looked huge. They scanned the area to make sure a Bigfoot didn't hide in the trees while they took turns rinsing and filling the buckets. Jake tucked his axe handle under his right arm and picked up 2 buckets of water and headed back to the cabin. Steve carried the pitchfork in one hand and a bucket of water in his other. Some of the water sloshed out of the buckets along the way, but they made it back with nearly 12 gallons between them. Steve sat his bucket down while he opened the cabin door, and then they carried their buckets inside and set them down between the stove and wall where they couldn't get knocked over and spilled. Jake placed a dinner plate over the top of each bucket to keep insects and debris out of the water. Jake grabbed 2 bottles of water and offered Steve one. He picked up a kitchen chair and stepped outside to sit until nightfall. Steve followed suit and brought the other chair out and set it down and set his water bottle on top of it. Jake lit a cigarette and watched as Steve went back into the cabin and brought the nails and hammer outside to repair the door. Steve struggled to hold the board in place and hammer the nails into it at the same time. Jake got up and held the board in place for him. The door was again secure, and they returned to their chairs and sat. Jake looked at his watch and noticed it fast approached 6:45 p.m. He said, "It's soon gonna be time to go inside for the night." The canopy of trees on the hillside around them made it darker than the open bottomland below them at this time of evening. The full moon was already slowly beginning to rise in the eastward sky. The light from the moon crept through the trees, and their new leaves produced dancing shadows on the ground as a slight breeze moved them around. Dusk was fast approaching, and they both sensed a feeling of foreboding which toyed endlessly with their psyche. They knew the creatures would return, but they didn't know when. They stood and headed back into the cabin. Jake placed his chair at the table between the table and the stove and sat. Steve placed his chair at the edge of the open doorway and sat. Jake lit the lantern on the shelves in the corner behind him, as well as the one on the table in front of him. Steve said, "I want to leave the door open as long as possible because of my claustrophobia. Just keep your eyes and ears open." "Don't worry, I will." They talked about the Bigfoot which broke through the cabin window. Steve asked, "Do you think it was the same one which ran Jean and Bo out of the road?" "I don't know. The color of the one we saw on the road looked a little lighter in color than the one which smashed through the window. The one which smashed through the window looked more like the one from across the river to me." Steve said, "I think the one on the road and the one at the window are the same Bigfoot." "I don't know. After thinking about it, I believe the Bigfoot which smashed through the window is a different one altogether," Jake said. "There's no real way to be sure unless we see them all grouped together at once, and that's something I personally don't want to see." "One is bad enough," Steve said. "I don't want to see a tribe of them running toward me." "Me neither," Jake said. Maybe we can try to get to the car tomorrow, and with the grace of God we can get out of here. It's just too risky, Steve said. Jake said, then maybe we can sneak as far as the bridge and see if the large male Bigfoot is still guarding the car. We can try that, but like you said earlier, what if we make it to the car and get rolled by one of these things while we're moving down the road? I guess that's a chance we'll have to take. They heard it would not come from several yards up the hillside in the area of the spring. They're coming, Jake said. Yeah, Steve said as he got up and moved his chair and closed and secured the door. He moved his chair across from Jake and sat. I'm not too hungry because I'm still full from lunch, Jake said. The leftovers from lunch are still sitting on the stove if you're hungry. I'm not hungry, but I need to use the chamber pot. Now, Jake asked as he rolled his eyes. Yeah, I didn't get a chance to go earlier. Since the lanterns are already burning, maybe the smell won't be quite so bad inside the cabin. Wise ass. Jake turned in his chair to face the wall while Steve dragged the chamber pot from under his cot and did his business. There's nothing like the modern conveniences of home, Steve said. Jake said, how right you are. Steve finished and placed the lid on the pot and slid it back under his army cot. Jake turned around in his chair to face Steve as he sat at the table. I wish I would have thought to grab the cards while we were at the house, Steve said. We could at least play a few hands of two-person spades or rummy to pass the time instead of just sitting here talking and waiting. Jake asked, what are you waiting for? He knew full well what Steve's response would be. The return of the creatures, of course, they said simultaneously. Jake asked, have you noticed anything odd about all the creatures we've seen? No, not really. Unless you're talking about how ugly and smelly they are. No, that's not it. Think about it. What? How the full-grown ones are different sizes. You're getting warmer. Just tell me. I'm tired of talking and thinking about them. Have you ever seen the famous Patterson-Gimlin film from the late 1960s about the supposed Bigfoot Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin saw and filmed in Bluff Creek, California? I think I might have seen it at least once. Jake asked, how good of a memory do you have? What's the point? Based on your memory of the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot, why do the creatures around here look so different? Steve thought about it for a few seconds and said, the Bigfoot in the film had boobs. Bingo! We haven't seen a single female Bigfoot around. All the ones we've seen have been male. What about the smaller one we saw come out of the retreat with the mirror the other day? That one looked like it might have small boobs. That figures. Like every other woman, all it's worried about is how it looks. That's why it took the mirror and left the food. Steve laughed. Because there are many creatures roaming around here, Jake said, there definitely has to be one or more breeding pairs. No doubt. Maybe they're like primeval human family units. Maybe the males are hunters while the females are gatherers. That makes sense. Maybe the females stay close to their offspring while they're gathering berries and the like and stay pretty well hidden in the brush. The males tend to be more out in the open during the daytime. And nighttime too, it seems, Steve said. If they are family units, how do you explain the two in the barnyard? The one in the pig pen and the other in the cow stable? Jake asked. Steve said, who knows? Maybe they're brothers and haven't moved on yet to start their own clan. That makes sense. They heard another tree knock which sounded closer than before. A return knock was heard from below the cabin near the edge of the bottom. Steve said, it sounds like they're not even trying to sneak up on us tonight. Yeah, their assault's gonna be brutal. The Bigfoot whose hand and fingers I smashed earlier with my club called in his reinforcements. Can you think of a way we can plug up the hole in the chinking? I might be able to nail a piece of firewood to the logs above and below the hole. Are there any nails left? Steve reached into his pants pocket and pulled out 5 nails. I can toenail the top and bottom on each end of the piece of firewood and drive one through its center. I guess that'll have to do. They searched through the woodpile to find a piece of firewood which would fit into the opening. Jake found a piece that was long enough but not thick enough to completely cover the hole. Steve pulled out a piece which seemed to be a perfect fit. He placed it in the space between the logs and moved it into position to completely cover the hole and toenailed it into place. After Steve covered over the hole and the chinking, he sat at the table. Jake got another fire going in the stove to heat up the remainder of the coffee which was left from breakfast. He said, "We're gonna have a long night." Steve nodded. Just as Jake started to pour him and Steve a cup of coffee, something smashed into the roof of the cabin. Steve jumped from the table and shouted, "There's a Bigfoot on the roof." "I don't think so." That sound had more of a metallic pitch to it. "Well, duh," Steve said as he paced back and forth. "The cabin has a tin roof, stupid." "No," Jake said. "It sounded like a rock hit the roof. Besides, there's no sound of anything walking around up there." Something again landed on the roof in the same general location as before. Jake said, "They're throwing rocks at the cabin." It sounded like another larger rock hit the cabin wall below the window, and another one hit the wall to the left of the door. Because the rocks now hit different walls of the cabin, Steve said, "There's definitely more than one of them out there throwing rocks." Jake nodded. Several larger rocks rained down on the roof of the cabin, and they both thought they heard one of the creatures walk around on the roof for a few seconds. It sounded like it walked from the back of the cabin toward the front, and they heard a loud thud hit the ground right outside the door. Something large hit the cabin door, and they couldn't tell if it was a rock or a Bigfoot. They waited a few seconds, and the door was struck again. It sounded like a Bigfoot rammed its shoulder against the door. It did this with such force they were sure the door would splinter at any moment. They heard grunts, hoots, howls, and growls come from every direction around the cabin. There had to be at least what sounded like a dozen or more creatures outside vocalizing and trying to get in. Jake said, "It sounds like we're in the monkey house at the zoo." Steve nodded. The attack on the cabin went on for what seemed like hours. Both of them stood ready to defend the cabin and themselves if a Bigfoot busted through the door or shutter. Steve stood with the pitchfork at the door and Jake stood with the axe at the window. Suddenly the assault stopped. It got deathly quiet outside. Nothing. "This is it," they shouted simultaneously. They held their breath and waited for several minutes and thought either the walls would cave in or worse, the cabin would be pushed from its foundation. Nothing. Nothing but deafening silence. They wondered if the creatures outside planned their final attack. More silence. They were extremely worried. They continued to wait for several more minutes and still nothing. There was a loud knock at the door and someone shouted, "Let me in. Let me in." Steve removed the brace from the door and cautiously pulled it open with the pitchfork at the ready. Bo pushed the door open and collapsed unconscious in the doorway. They grabbed Bo under each arm and dragged him into the cabin. Steve closed and replaced the brace on the back of the door and returned to help Jake lift Bo into Jake's cot. Bo's face was covered in blood. He had several cuts and bruises on his forehead and a big gash on his right cheek. Both his upper and lower lips were split in two and bled. Blood also ran down his right arm. His upper right and left arms also appeared heavily bruised, and the front of his t-shirt had 4 long bloody slashes in it which ran from his chest to his abdomen. They wondered if his injuries were sustained from the earlier wreck or if the creatures had gotten a hold of him. Jake said, "Please dig down through my duffel bag and get me a washcloth and towel and wet it in one of the buckets of water beside the stove." Steve returned with the wet washcloth and handed it to Jake. Jake said, "Please fetch me the lantern from the shelves and sit it on the floor next to Bo's head so I can see what I'm doing." "No, that's not gonna work. It's hampering my vision more than it's helping. The glare's casting weird shadows on the walls. Please bring a chair over from the table to sit the lantern on so it'll be at the same height as the cot." Jake wiped away the dirt and blood from Bo's face and dried his wounds with the towel as he went. Jake started with Bo's forehead and worked his way down to the gash on his right cheek. Jake wiped the blood away from the gash and put pressure on it for several seconds to stop the flow of blood which came from his cheek. It was difficult to wipe the blood away because the washcloth stuck in his dark beard stubble. Each time Jake wiped the blood away, it seemed the gash bled even more. He patted the blood away from the wound instead. Jake said, "Please bring the bucket of water closer to the cot." Steve said, "You can quit saying please. Just tell me what you need and I'll do it." "All right." Jake dipped the washcloth into the bucket to rinse it out and then wrung the excess water out of it into the chamber pot he pulled out from underneath the cot. He next moved to Bo's split lips and cleaned them up. He rolled Bo's right shirt sleeve up and looked to find the source of the blood flow, which came from his right arm. There was a deep tear across the front of his right bicep. Jake again put pressure on the tear to slow the flow of blood. Jake said, "Help me remove Bo's t-shirt, boots, and jeans to see if he sustained any injuries to his torso and legs." There were several deep scratches across his chest and upper abdomen which had barely broken through his skin. Jake cleaned the scratches up and then moved to another deep gash on Bo's left thigh. Jake applied pressure like before to the gash to stop the flow of blood. He re-wet and wrung the washcloth out and worked on the gash on Bo's right arm again. The bleeding from the rest of his injuries subsided. He held the washcloth over the gash on Bo's right arm for several more minutes before the bleeding stopped. He gently moved his hands back and forth over Bo's arms and legs after he fully straightened them to feel for any broken bones and was convinced he didn't have any. Jake pulled the blanket out from underneath Steve's duffel bag and draped it over the top of Bo. He gently lifted his head and placed his pillow underneath it. He said, "Fetch me a flashlight because I want to check Bo's eyes to see if he might be in a state of shock." Jake opened Bo's right eyelid and shined the beam from the flashlight above his eye onto his forehead. His right pupil was somewhat dilated. He did the same to Bo's left eye, and his left pupil was somewhat dilated as well. This is a clear indication Bo's in a mild to moderate state of shock, Jake thought as he gently pulled the pillow out from under Bo's head and placed it under his feet. "Fetch the pillow from your cot to put under his feet as well," Jake said as he glanced at Steve. "If I had to guess, based on his injuries, mainly from the scratches on his chest and upper abdomen, I'd venture to say he's had a run-in with a bigfoot. The pattern of the scratches on his chest looks like a bigfoot raked its long fingernails across his chest and upper abdomen." Steve pulled the blanket away from Bo's upper body and looked at the scratches and said, "It does sort of look like that." Jake said, "We won't know for sure until he regains consciousness and can tell us what happened. Cover him back up with the blanket and throw a few more pieces of firewood in the stove because we need to keep the inside of the cabin warm. The temperature of a shock victim usually drops rapidly and we have to keep him warm." "I did all I can do. It's up to him to pull through now." Steve recovered Bo and walked over to the stove to stoke the fire. "Where'd you learn how to do all that stuff?" "I learned to clean wounds and treat shock victims by taking a Red Cross first aid course years ago," Jake said. "You have to elevate the shock victim's legs to get the blood flowing back to their heart and brain. Doing that also helps them regain consciousness a lot faster." Jake returned to the table and sat down exhausted. He lit a cigarette and opened a bottle of water. He took a few sips of the water and stood and went back over to Bo and held his head up and poured a few sips of water into his mouth. Bo swallowed the water, so this was a good sign. It started to get really warm inside the cabin, so Jake re-wet the washcloth and folded it in half and placed it over Bo's forehead before he moved back to the table to sit again. Jake's watch told him it was 12:41 a.m., and he turned to look at Steve and said, "You should go ahead and try to get some sleep. I'll sit here and tend to Bo should he need anything." "Are you sure?" Steve asked. "Yeah, go on to bed," Jake said. "I'm too worked up right now to try to sleep anyway. I'm gonna have another cup of coffee and smoke another cigarette." "Okay. But if you need me to help with anything, wake me up," Steve said as he walked to his cot. He laid down and reached between both cots to the chair to extinguish the lantern which burned next to Bo's head. Jake got up and threw his cigarette but into the fire chamber in the stove and walked over to Steve and said, "Hand me the lantern, I'll set it back on the shelves to get it out of the way. By the way, thank you for helping me tend to Bo." Steve handed Jake the lantern and said, "You're welcome." It was no big deal, as he made himself comfortable and rolled over to go to sleep. Jake walked over to the shelves and sat the lantern down and walked back to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee, then sat and lit another cigarette. He turned the wick down on the lantern, which burned on the table to further dim the light inside the cabin. Jake must have fallen asleep at some point and slept for a few hours with his head on the table. He awakened suddenly to the sound of Bo as he moaned while he tried to sit up in the cot. Jake turned the wick back up on the lantern to cast more light into the room. He stood and walked over and sat in the chair next to Bo. Bo sat straight up in the cot and Jake placed his right hand on Bo's back and tried to comfort him. Bo asked, "Where am I?" while he held his forehead. "You're here in the cabin with me and Steve," Jake whispered while he pointed to Steve, who was asleep on the other cot. Bo wanted to get out of the cot and move to the table, so Jake helped him swing his legs over the side of the cot to stand up. Jake stood and helped Bo to his feet while he held on to him. Jake continued to hold on to him while they stood beside the cot for a few minutes to make sure Bo didn't get lightheaded and pass out. "I cleaned up your injuries to the best of my ability and checked to see if you had any broken bones. I didn't find any." Bo whispered, "That's good." Before he helped Bo to the table, Jake whispered, "Hold on a second. I want to move the other chair to the other side of the table near the door before I help you across the room to sit down." Jake walked across the room to move the chair while Bo held onto the cot and the cabin wall for support. Jake walked over to Bo and wrapped the blanket around him, and then positioned his left arm around the front of Bo's waist and his right arm around his shoulders. Jake helped him limp over to the table while he tried to keep the pressure off of his left leg. They made it to the table where Jake helped Bo sit. Jake walked back toward his cot and picked up the other chair and set it between the stove and the table and asked, "Do you want something to drink?" before he sat back down. Bo ran his fingers over the gash on his right cheek and over his lips and winced from the pain and shook his head. Jake said, "You're lucky to be alive after a Bigfoot attacked you." Bo's eyes widened, and with a confused look on his face he whispered, "What? Didn't a Bigfoot attack you?" Jake whispered, his eyebrows raised. "No," Bo whispered and tried to smile. "How did you get injured then?" Jake whispered. Bo whispered, "Gene drove the truck, and when we rounded the curve leading down the road to the bottom of the mountain, a huge black Bigfoot was standing in the middle of the road. It started running toward us and Gene swerved and slammed on the brakes. The left front fender of my truck struck it near its waist. Gene and me were still skidding to a stop when it screamed and pushed the truck toward the embankment. The right front tire slid over the side and the truck tilted sideways, and before we knew it, the truck rolled. It rolled one complete revolution and I started to fly out the window. I was almost completely free, but my feet got caught up in the frame of the open passenger window, and as the truck started to make its second revolution, I was thrown free. The centrifugal force flung me about 60 feet into the air, and I landed in the canopy of a large oak tree where I was knocked unconscious. I laughed when you asked me if a Bigfoot attacked me, but I guess you can say in a way, one did. Jake said, "When we arrived at the crash site, we thought it was you that died at the scene. We assumed it was you because you were the one who drove earlier. Gene's body so badly burned Steve or me couldn't identify him. We saw the Bigfoot standing in the road above the crash site and watched it take off into the woods and head up toward the top of the mountain. We scouted the area trying to find you. We even went back to what was left of the truck and lifted the bed to look and see if you were trapped underneath it. We weren't sure if both you and Gene came back. We thought maybe one of you stayed behind at your cabin. We never thought to look in the treetops." "Unfortunately not," Bo said as he glanced toward the floor and said, "I don't know how long I laid there in the treetops. It was dark when I regained consciousness. I didn't even know what happened or where I was. I tried to turn over and sit up. In the tree branch I landed on let go and I fell about 40 feet down through the branches and hit the ground. I briefly lost consciousness again when I hit the ground. I regained consciousness a short time later and got up and tried to get my bearings and headed toward the crash site. I've never been so thankful for a full moon. The moonlight allowed me to navigate through the darkness. When I arrived at the truck, I saw the charred remains of Jean and the condition of my truck. I felt helpless and angry at this point and didn't know what to do or where to go. I heard what sounded like several creatures screaming, grunting, howling, and growling off in the distance. I practically crawled to the front porch of your grandparents' house and rested there for a little bit as I again tried to get my bearings. I then tried to make my way here to the cabin. I got to the bottom of the trail leading up here and realized you and Steve were under attack. I hid in the weeds at the bottom of the trail until the attack stopped and I heard the creatures retreat back into the woods. I waited until I could no longer hear the creatures at all, and that's when I managed to make it up the trail and banged on the door. I had my double-barreled shotgun with me, but I guess I lost it in the wreck. My shotgun had a slug in each chamber, and I also have a mixture of several slugs and 00 buck in my jeans pockets. Jake said, I saw a hunting rifle in the wreckage, but it didn't survive the fire. The stock had completely burned up, and the barrel was bent and twisted. The bullets in the truck went off because of the intensity of the fire. We kept hearing a popping sound and realized they were exploding. Steve nor I either one saw your shotgun anywhere when we scouted the area while looking for you. You're lucky to be alive. I want to get a fire going in the stove and make a fresh pot of coffee. It'll soon be daylight and maybe we can scout the area to try and find your shotgun. Bo said, that sounds like a plan because we're not going to have any other way to escape except to shoot the Bigfoot that tries to stop us. If the shotgun isn't in the area where you and Steve scouted yesterday, then I have no idea where it could have ended up. Please tune in next week as we continue on with the next installment of A Journey Through Hell and Back. For those who cannot wait, this title is available on Amazon.com. A link to the book is available in the description below the video. Please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the continuing saga.